This is a continuation of part 1, obviously, of modalities of interaction. And just a bit of a recap over here. We have Milgram's reality virtuality continuum, and we have a bunch of different types of interactions, different modes of interactions that's littered along the continuum. Ones in bold are the ones we had a look at. We broke down the various components, and then we saw what's special about them, what kind of trade-offs they've had to make to concentrate on their particular niche. Now, if we were to list out all the different modes of interaction that we currently have, this would immediately blow up into something pretty huge that we can't really manage. So it's useful to put all this confusion into some kind of framework. And now we get back to this interaction cycle model thing that we first had a look at in week 1. Let's just review it and look at it from a different perspective now. This is by no means the definitive model for all of immersive interactions. Think of this as a starting point, and if you have contributions to make to this model, please share it with the rest of the class. Let us know. Maybe you'll be like, oh, there's a gap over here, Matt. Maybe we should add something else over there. We didn't think about this other thing. How does the model incorporate that? So please don't think of this as gospel truth that will never change. Now, with that disclaimer out of the way, let's go through this model. Let's see how useful it is. Let's start with the smiley face right there in the very middle, which is our user. And then you'll see there's like a little cycle thing happening there. From our user, we've got our state tracking systems. This is the part that tells us what our user is currently doing, where they're looking at, what they're holding, or where their hands are at, their body posture, if they have anything that they're saying at the moment. If we're lucky enough, we might even have access to their brain waves, or any other type of neuroelectrical signals that they might be giving off, like muscle signals around your wrists to know how your hands are oriented, or I think heartbeat counts as neuroelectrical signals, so let's just say heartbeats. And I'm catching myself getting sidetracked here a little bit, so let's get back to it. So essentially, we need to know what our user is currently doing. This information is then fed to our interaction control systems, so we can then decide what to do with all that information. This interaction control system would not only take data from our user, but any number of other things, like maybe it needs to keep track of other characters within the interaction system, within the immersive environment. Maybe it needs to keep track of objects. It definitely needs to keep track of terrain, if that's something that our design calls for. If it needs to communicate with other external systems, then it's going to do that. And just by the very nature of things, this singular interaction control system that we're referring to now would of course be made up of even smaller subsystems working together to become a whole. So it's not really just one thing. We just think of it as one thing. We can nitpick the details to death, but let's pull back a little bit and just think of this as an abstract construct called the interaction control system. And essentially, it's where we decide what to do with the information that we take. Once we've made the decision, though, we need to feed that back to the user, and we then have any number of ways to get that back to the user. There's a lot of emphasis on visual feedback, so there's a lot of work on displays and all sorts of magic associated there. Sound is a thing, and so are haptics. Feedback in this case is something a little bit more direct, something more sensory. So it's not like feedback in terms of, hey, here's a form and then fill it out and then we'll do something about it. It's more immediate. And of course, this is the sort of thing that you study in 9901. But for now, let's just wrap it up in this concept of sensory feedback. So we take the sensory feedback, give it back to the user. They react. They use their own agency to do whatever they need to do. And then we, as the designer, would keep track of whatever they're doing through our state tracking systems, and then the whole cycle goes around in a circle all over again. Does that sound pretty reasonable? So in this slide, I tried very hard not to mention any specific technologies that are involved in any of these steps. In fact, we don't even need any technology. We can apply this model to real-life situations with no virtual objects to deal with whatsoever. The picture that I was trying to paint there was that this concept of interaction control system that we have is actually made up of lots of other little things that come together to form a coherent design, and it's our job as immersive designers for that coherent design to come through. It also helps us a lot to know what kind of information that we're able to take advantage of, so it's also important for us to know what the state tracking systems are. And by the same token, it's also important for us to know what's available for us in terms of sensory feedback. And all this together results in, hopefully, if we've done things right, a good, nice immersive experience for our user, and they'll come back to our restaurant. And of course, I'm not really talking about restaurants. I'm talking about immersive design and immersive systems in general. And I know things can get really overwhelming at times. There's just a lot of technology and things out there that we can put together and recombine to create any number of compelling immersive experiences. So for the rest of this lecture, I propose we look at ingredients that we can put into our conceptual restaurant, and the conceptual restaurant being our immersive design practice. So let's look at eye tracking. Where does this fit in that framework that we talked about from the previous slide? That was, I think, the third slide, by the way, so from now on let's refer to that as slide 3. So where does eye tracking actually fit in the slide 3 framework? And I'll have to ask you to indulge me. I know you know the answer, but I'd just like us to break this down a little bit. Going through this activity will help us tease out some of the issues, especially if we encounter something that doesn't quite fit into these distinct categories. So let's start with something simple like eye tracking. Does eye tracking give the user information, or does it take information from the user? Does it make any decisions? And just to be clear, we're only looking at the eye tracking systems here at the moment. It's possible for eye tracking information to be used in other situations, but we're only looking at the eye tracking. And what can the eye tracking do? Most eye tracking systems these days consist of a bunch of infrared cameras that look straight into our eyes. It can then have a look at our irises, and by extension it can have a look at the size of our pupils. It can also see where the iris is looking comparatively in contrast to the whites of our eyes. So we can kind of already tell this is very biometric-y, biometric-like. Let's just say it's very biometric. It literally measures something to do with our bodies that's biological. But this description is very low level and raw. What information does it actually give us? Well, it gives us something called a gaze vector. And if you could just imagine laser beams coming out of your eyes and then eventually ending up somewhere, that's basically what a gaze vector gives us. And this is very useful because we can use that to know what our user is looking at. We can know what our user is looking at in the virtual environment. We can know what our user is looking at in the real environment if they can actually see through into the real world. So this is very useful from an interaction design standpoint because it's like we now have access to someone's mouse cursor. We know what they're hovering over, so we could use it for something like object selection. If we're representing virtual avatars for our users in virtual reality, we can then just directly translate their eyeballs. If it's in a multi-user environment, then that would mean that the avatars in that environment have eyeball gaze visible by all the other users collaborating in that environment, which would then make it a little bit more natural to interact with each other. Evolutionarily, eye gaze is a really important subconscious cue that we detect But certainly it would make the experience much more immersive because we now have an extra social cue that we would normally have in the real world. In interactions that lack eye tracking for avatar representation, what we usually have is just where people's heads are pointing. But if we add eyeballs to that as well, that's a free win. I won't dwell on this too much because it is quite subtle, but if you were just to confirm this by looking up the evolutionary role of social eye gaze, uh, hopefully that convinces you. It's really quite important in terms of human interaction. But moving on, we can also use eye tracking data to measure someone's cognitive load and maybe even stress. So we can get this information just by looking at pupil dilation. Pupil dilation. Sorry, one more time. Pupil dilation. If the pupil is opened up particularly wide, that means that we're processing quite a bit of information at that same time, and we're trying to gather as much light into our eyes as possible to enhance our situational awareness. Basically, it just shows that something has our attention and we're concentrating on it. We can also tell a lot by the variability of pupil dilation and also where our gaze is going. So if someone's moving across really quickly, like scanning a page or scanning a particular field of view, maybe they're looking for predators or something like that. So while we can't really tell what someone is exactly thinking by looking at their eye movements, we can infer some of their mental state. And this is very useful from an interaction design standpoint because we can take advantage of that, right? So if we're making a horror experience and we're not getting those stress indicators from our user, we can then dynamically increase the amount of stressful stimulus in our experience. So let's say Jurassic Park, the T-Rex isn't scaring people enough, so you add in another T-Rex in there or something, or maybe snakes. On the other end of the spectrum, maybe it's a relaxing app, a meditation app, and then we would want the opposite, right? Like we would want all the stress indicators to actually go down and make the environment more relaxing. I'm mentioning all these different things because you really get to appreciate how we can now have the power to create super compelling interactive experiences. Now, in the past, if you were a filmmaker or maybe you're writing a novel, you needed to have some kind of insight into how people thought, what their emotional responses were, and then you would use tools in your wheelhouse to elicit those responses. But you just had to trust that those responses worked, just from your own experience and your own craftsmanship. But now we actually have direct access to people's emotional states, and we can kind of cheat a little bit. And that's just from a very blunt instrument like stress and cognitive load. We don't necessarily need to take advantage of this in a entertainment or fictional experience. We could also use it in a more productive industry type application for immersive design. Like let's say you're a mining technician or someone in an unsafe environment like a construction site or even a warehouse. We can combine the stress and workload indicators with something more concrete like the gaze-based information. So we not only know what our users are looking at, we also know how roughly stressed they are. So we can use this as a kind of measure of situational awareness. So if you're in a forklift and let's say someone had an augmented reality headset on and they were using our app, we could use the information coming in from the cameras looking outside to notice any obstacles. Let's say another teammate that's walking across the path of the forklift. That's a super dangerous situation, right? So if we detect that our forklift driver isn't actually looking at the teammate that's walking across, and we also detect that the forklift driver is experiencing high stress or workload levels, then we can do something about it. We can give them an even higher warning to say, hey, there's someone in there, or we can even intervene, like if our augmented reality app is somehow connected to the forklift, we can just stop the forklift and then give a very stern warning to the forklift driver and say, hey, pay more attention, stop looking at 9gag on your phone or something like that. I don't know. But I'm catching myself again. It's getting to be a bit of a hand-wavy rant, but the picture that I wanted to try and paint for you guys was that you can actually do a lot of this stuff just by this eye tracking information that we're getting. And from a slightly higher level, this shows that it's really worth knowing what our ingredients are to be able to really take advantage of them from an interaction design standpoint. And the ingredients being all the tools that we have. And in this case, we're just looking at eye tracking. So maybe you've come up with some ideas of your own already. And if you have, we'd love to hear about it. Please post it in the forum just randomly. I'll give you 200 kudos points for starting a thread with some kind of idea that you have. So I sense a little bit that we've spent quite a bit of time on eye tracking. But before we move on to the next thing, I just wanted to quickly mention that we can also use eye tracking information for more direct sensory feedback. So what we've been talking about just now would be a little bit higher level. So when I say that, I mean things that are slightly just a little bit further down the line from when we sense something. So all those affordances, being able to know what our user is looking at, for example, and then doing something about it, like object selection, that's an affordance. But we can also use eye tracking information to enable and enhance quote-unquote sensory hacks. So one really favorite thing of mine is dynamic foveated rendering. Now, we talked about foveated rendering, and just as a bit of a reminder, it's where we render the graphics in the middle of our vision at full resolution. Outside of that narrow band of full resolution, we don't render it as high. And people will still perceive the same quality image, but we're not spending quite as much computing resources. So that's a cool hack that enables higher frame rates, less motion sickness, and that kind of thing. But what we've talked about so far has just been fixed foveated rendering. That is, we're just assuming where the user is actually looking at in the screen. So now that we have eye tracking information, what we can actually do is follow where the user really is looking at and move around where the full resolution is being rendered. So in fixed foveated rendering, if the user looks away from our assumed center of vision, then they'll see blurry things. But with eye tracking, the user can just move their eyeballs anywhere inside our headset, and the full resolution will still follow them because we're actually following them with eye tracking. So that's really cool, isn't it? We can also use eye tracking to manipulate what objects are being focused in our display. As of right now, the year 2022, most of the displays that we have access to are what we call flat single focus displays. And for most situations, this is perfectly fine, but we suspect that there might be a bit of a safety issue in long-term use because we're not shifting focus in our lenses, in our eyes. We're always looking at the same thing. The display doesn't move, so it's always going to be in the same focus. And as a bit of an anecdote, I noticed this in a friend of mine that was playing Robo Recall for hours. And then lunchtime came, we tried to go for lunch, and then she found that she felt a bit funny when walking outside of the headset. If she jumped back into the headset, she walked fine, but when she took the headset off, it was like, what's going on here? And I suspect that is because her eyes just needed to reacclimatize to doing dynamic focus in the real world, because we need to do that in the real world. And there's a really quick trick we can do to illustrate this. So please just hold up your finger in front of you, the moderate distance away from your face, and look at your finger, the tip of your finger. you'll notice that the background is blurred, but your finger is completely focused. Now do the other thing and look away from the finger and look further into the background. You'll notice that your background is now focused, but not your finger. So that stuff is what we get for free in the real world. But if you're in a flat display inside a current generation virtual reality headset, you're not going to see that blurring effect as you look between the background and your finger. Like absolutely everything will be in focus. We still see a perception of depth because we're using the triangulation. You have slightly different images between your left eye and right eye, but the focus is exactly the same. So that's kind of a problem, that's kind of a weird thing. If you're in that state for too long and you get used to it, you start to forget how to autofocus in the real world, at least in the case of Zian, my friend. So it's a worthwhile problem to solve. One way to solve it is just not have flat displays and use what's called light field displays, and I've posted links to those in the Discover section. But another way to solve this problem is just look at what we're looking at in terms of eye tracking data and change the focus on the screen artificially based on what you're gazing at. There's another variation to this. You can also use eye tracking information to actually change the focal lengths or the focus distance of the displays physically, as well as on the display as well in terms of the image that you're showing. And all this is just based on the eye tracking data that you get from knowing what you're actually looking at. And going back to our finger example, the concrete way that this is done is if you detect that your user is looking at the finger, you make the finger focused and blur out the background. And if you detect that your user isn't looking at the finger but the background, then you do the other thing. You make the background focused and the finger blurred. I just thought it was worth mentioning because it is actually a thing, but it's not something that we would directly design for because a lot of these would have already been built in to either the game engine or the operating system that we're using. But it's just good to be aware of these issues. So when one of your friends says that they can't walk right because they're seeing things funny after playing Robo Recall on your VR headset for 5 hours straight, that you will know the cause. Okay, we've spent a lot of time on eye tracking, so let's go ahead and move on to facial tracking. This should be pretty quick. Many of us would have already experienced this quite often as well. So an example of this would be Instagram filters or Snapchat filters. Even if you're kind of a professional, you'll notice that these filters also exist in Zoom and Microsoft Teams. Yeah, basically this is where you overlay funny things on top of people's faces, so we can track faces and put stuff on top of it. We can also see individual facial features. So if you smile, you can make the visualization smile too. And if you were representing an avatar, you can make that avatar smile. You can synchronize lips. And I guess just in the same way that detecting eyeball gaze and then adding that into the avatar representation, that's just another subconscious social cue that humans use like pretty much unconsciously, I guess unless if you've got Asperger's. But yeah, for most neurotypical people, you would be using these social cues unconsciously, and it would just be really good to have these unconscious cues taken into the virtual space if we are using it in the virtual space. And the way to do that is have sensors looking at your face. Yeah, pretty simple actually. I can't think of any direct sensory feedback applications for facial tracking in the same way that eye gaze has, but maybe you can think of some. If you do, you're very welcome to share it in the forum. That would be a really great thing to discuss. But one cool thing that we can use from facial tracking, apart from dumb filters, is we can have an idea of what people's emotional state is again. So this is going to be a slightly higher resolution than just is someone stressed or not stressed? Is someone focusing their thoughts on something, or are they pretty relaxed and ready to receive more inputs? So that's what we get from pupil dilation and eye motion. But with facial tracking, we can get people's emotions somewhat. When you see someone smile, you've got a pretty good idea that they're happy. There's a good chance that this is true. When you see someone frowning, that you can kind of tell that they're upset about something. Or if they're showing their teeth and their eyebrows are turning into a bit of a V, you know that they're somewhat angry about something and maybe they're about to attack you. Now, for most of us, these are very intuitive things. And they're intuitive because we've evolved with them for such a long time. And a lot of these reactions are involuntary, actually. So that's why we have this expression. You should have seen your face, like, I don't know, when we surprise someone, or like, I don't know, do a pretty good prank. So you should have seen your face when I did blah. And yes, we can consciously control our facial expressions. And I think in some circles we call it acting or something like that. Just go across the street to NIDA if that's the thing that you want to do. NIDA is the National Institute for Dramatic Arts, so that's where you go when you want to cause drama. Sorry, do drama, not cause drama. But yeah, taking all the jokes aside, facial reactions are an unconscious reaction to things, and us as designers can take advantage of that by looking at our users' facial reactions and then tailoring our experiences based on that, in a similar way to how we discussed it for managing stress and cognitive load in the eye tracking. And now that we have a much fuller range of emotional tracking, this is called affect tracking, we can do something like affect synchronization, where we basically match our experience with our users' emotional states, whatever our design may be. And that's something that hasn't really been done too much. So it'd be really good if us in this class would do stuff like this and get famous for doing it. And we really have this opportunity. That's why this field is super exciting. Now, having said that, facial tracking and also eye tracking is not very commonly available right now, and right now is March 2022, but it's good to know that these things are available now, so we can start designing for it. It's still within the specialist domain. The equipment you need to get is a little bit expensive, but it opens us up to designing really powerful experiences. And when I say equipment, I don't necessarily mean tech. This stuff is already happening in theme parks. So if you were to go to, say, Walt Disney World over in Florida, you'll see a bunch of actors pretending to be characters from the stories, but they're not acting out a particular play or a particular scene in the play. They're walking amongst the public, the users of this immersive experience, which means you can actually interact with them dynamically as if you were talking to those fictional characters in the real world. Now, their reactions to you is constrained by scripts and rules and things like that, but it gives you that illusion, right? And the only way they can do that is because they're able to assess your state and look at where you're looking, have a look at your face, how you're reacting to them, listen to what you're saying, etc., etc. And it's a really powerful experience when you do have it, right? Because it's like you're not just sitting there watching a film, you're participating in it. I mean, that's pretty amazing, right? It's amazing. But we have a limitation. The only people that can design for those experiences are the employees of those multi-million-dollar theme parks,
because we need to hire actors, we need to hire people who build props and costumes and things like that. The cool thing about having them virtual is basically everything becomes free, almost. The only thing that we need to pay for is production of the digital assets, and then once it's there, we have it perpetually. And our audience expands exponentially. It's not just the people that can afford to go to these venues, pay for accommodation and tickets to get into the theme park. It's everyone, and that's the opportunity that we have right now. I mean, it's not quite here yet, but you can see it coming. It's coming soon. And I'm probably preaching to the converted, so I'm gonna stop preaching. And that's a very optimistic vision of biometrics in immersive design.
Let's move to the next slide and talk about something that's a little bit more ambiguous in terms of whether it's going to be good or bad for us. Neuroelectrical interfaces, or more commonly known as brain-computer interfaces. Now, I just wanted to clarify that when we say neuroelectrical, we actually mean any signal that has to do with our nervous system. So it's not actually just the brain. So it would include stuff to do with our muscles. Our heartbeat is a neuroelectrical signal. If we move our fingers and we were detecting the electricity coming up through our arms, those are neuroelectrical signals too. And of course, the most prominent neuroelectrical signal that a lot of people like to talk about is stuff that comes from the brain, hence brain-computer interfaces. Now, in a sense, this is kind of the ultimate interface into the human, because it bypasses everything and just goes straight to the source. So in the other sensors, the other modes of detection, the other interfaces, we would be either listening to sound, we'd be looking at where the eyes are going, we'd be looking at where the fingers are physically. So in the other types of biometrics that we had a look at, we would be looking at the results of neuroelectrical signals being sent throughout our body. So if our fingers or our arms were to have moved in a certain way, it would have come as a result of our brain sending out a signal through our nervous system, through our muscles, and then finally a button, a camera, a motion sensor would then detect that motion, and the detection of that physical change is the actual thing that triggers whatever it is in our system that's supposed to react to the human. So in other words, other biometrics are measured this way. It starts from the brain, goes through the nervous system, goes through the muscles, and depending on where those muscles are, we produce motion, we produce speech, eye movement, etc. And then external sensors then observe those physical changes, which we can then feed into our state tracking system. Now, the cool thing about neuroelectrical interfaces, or brain-computer interfaces, is we just go straight to the neuroelectrical signal. We don't wait to measure any physical changes. This is why sometimes people can refer to BCIs as kind of a mind control thing, because it sometimes literally is mind control. And nerds like me love this concept because you can try and pretend to be a Jedi. Like, you know how you move things with just your mind. But this is actually a bit more profound than just useless geekery. Now, if you think about people that can't make the physical changes that those other sensors detect. So let's say if we take hand motion detection, for example, what if you're paralyzed? What if you can't actually move your hand? Let's even take it further than that. What if your hand is actually missing? What if it was cut off in an industrial accident? This is where BCIs can really have some utility. So these signals can be used to drive pretty much anything. It can be used to control wheelchairs. It can be used to detect finger motion, even if your fingers aren't actually there. And there are several instances of BCIs directly being used to drive prosthetics. Now, instinctively, this seems to be a little bit beyond our remit, in terms of us doing immersive design as immersive designers. But there is some merit in us thinking about these kinds of things, designing for inclusivity, for example. In other words, designing for disabled people. And we'll talk about that in depth in week 8. But for this week, it's just generally good to know what's available out there for us to be able to use when designing experiences, because we can actually create some really compelling experiences with BCIs. Now, when we were talking about facial tracking, we discussed the affect synchronization, and we were just proposing assigning feelings or tracking a user's state by looking at their face and how they're reacting to the environment, to the characters that we're presenting to them. With BCIs, we can directly detect what's actually happening. So in essence, in the same way that we can use BCIs to allow our users to have a kind of mind control, that very same ability can also allow us to actually read their minds, like in a quite literal sense. Now, we don't quite know enough about brain signals to be able to, to visualize thoughts and project dreams onto a screen like some movies would indicate. But we don't really need the detection to be that level of fidelity to be useful to us as designers. Like, let's say even a simple affordance like selecting objects or selecting modes without having to move your arms or do anything other than have a thought. That's already pretty powerful. Yeah, so it's good to have this mode of interaction in your radar, because it could just be really useful to you. I guess we'll end talking about this slide by thinking about direct sensory feedback using neuroelectrical interfaces. That's a super scary thought. The simplest I can think of is just giving someone a mild electric shock, like say in psychology experiments to induce stress in people. But it could go a lot further than that. If we remember the movie The Matrix, not only were people sending thoughts to the Matrix to run their virtual avatars, the Matrix was also sending back thoughts in the same way that a computer would send back images into a head-mounted display, for example. It's just that instead of that signal having to go through our eyes and through our retina, it just goes straight to our visual cortex. And just think about that for a little bit. Is that scary for you? Do you like the idea? Maybe something to talk a bit more about when we get to week 8, hey? But let's stay on direct sensory feedback and move on to haptics. That's a bit less scary, isn't it? Now, haptic feedback seems to be the last thing that immersive designers think about. It seems to me the rank order of consideration starts from the visuals, and then it gets to the auditory, and then haptics is in there somewhere as a bit of an afterthought. And it might very well be a pragmatic decision, because having good haptic feedback is actually quite expensive. The gold standard of haptic feedback would be just reality, right? You touch something, it has the correct texture, it has the correct pressure. So if you touch a cup and you squeeze it, it's proportional to what you would expect. And if it's a porcelain cup, it has that nice porcelain feel touch that you feel in your finger. And that's fine, I guess. If we go back to our restaurant example, you're making a restaurant and you need to have all those real objects for people to eat off of, so it's built into the cost. But if we're talking about a narrative experience or a fictional experience or a training scenario, like say in a flight simulator, for example, it's not practical to just have everything be real. But it's still pretty important to have some elements be real. So that's why we would use mixed reality in those situations as a pragmatic solution, I guess. So for example, with some flight simulators, they would actually use the exact same components as the real cockpit of the aircraft, except that outside of the cockpit you'd have a screen, for example. So the student would basically be developing the same kind of muscle memory that they would be developing in a real aircraft, except with none of the risks and none of the fuel costs, which is relevant these days. And this is quite effective as a training tool already. In fact, it's so effective that you can actually have, say, CASA certify a simulator for people to train on them and actually get qualifications just by training on those simulators alone. And we'll talk a little bit about that later when we get to the ACE Training Center. But yeah, mixed reality is a very useful tool for us immersive designers when haptic feedback and fidelity in that area is really important to us. But in the cases where it's not really that important, where it's just basically adding extra sensory feedback or extra icing on the cake, we can get away with simpler things. So the main haptic feedback that most people are familiar with these days would probably be what they get in their phones. And that's mainly used to convey notifications and that kind of thing. So I'd say that's a bit of a stretch to say that's part of immersive design. But if I were to take you back to my childhood, which a lot of my examples seem to have come from, Nintendo 64 first introduced this thing called a Rumble Pack. Now, you might recognize this name, Nintendo. They're a big games company with the current device being the Nintendo Switch. Now, I'm going to ask the non-gamer people to just do their best to tolerate this a little bit because, a studio like Nintendo is actually quite relevant in the immersive design space. They've made some really wonderful immersive experiences through their games. So you can't really just discount them because they deal in mass market products that are usually aimed towards children. They've actually made some quite significant contributions to our field. But anyway, they first introduced this thing called the Rumble Pack, which essentially was a device that would vibrate in coordination to what would be happening in the virtual experience itself, like on screen. So let's say if there was some kind of a monster dropping in from somewhere high or stamping onto the ground, the Rumble Pack would vibrate. And this might seem a little bit gimmicky, and I guess even back then it kind of was. But if you were to combine this with the visual feedback and the auditory feedback, and then also the haptic feedback, it actually creates a pretty compelling experience, which is why I think it's survived for this long. Now, when we look at any typical VR hand controller, like say for the Oculus Quest, or even the Vive or the Pico, they have the same vibration motors, they have the same feedback. And even though it started as a bit of a cheap trick, it's still relevant enough to be included in contemporary platforms. And as designers, my attitude is, if it's there, why not use it? We should also be more aware of more advanced haptic feedback solutions, and there is no shortage of those. I guess the issue with them is that they're slightly more expensive. Now, I guess if you're designing for a specific client that already have these devices available, then maybe it doesn't matter so much. But if we were designing for the general consumer and putting software up, let's say on the Oculus Quest store, then we don't have this available to us. Not yet, anyway. Designing a general haptic solution, especially in the virtual space, is quite a challenging thing to do because you're basically trying to create something from nothing. And I guess we could fake that sensory experience by writing directly to our brains, but we've already established that we don't have that ability just yet. So what are we left with? We're left with proprietary and pretty expensive solutions. Let's take, for example, the Touch Haptic Device by 3D Systems. As far as I can tell, there are two main applications for this device, but essentially it's just a kind of a stylus or a pen, but on the other end of it are a bunch of resistive motors, so it can simulate actually going up against something. So this is really useful for sculpting, like pretending that you're sculpting clay. So you can have pretty convincing sensory experience by just like simulating the resistive qualities of clay. That's if you're using kind of a clay stylish or a clay brush or something like that to sculpt the clay. And you can also apply the same logic by simulating a scalpel. So surgical students would use this, in addition to more traditional medical training, which would usually involve things that are a bit more expensive and a bit more risky, like, real blades, cadavers, maybe even real patients. I guess you could also use something like this as part of a cooking simulation too. Yeah, I don't know. You can think of lots of ways to utilize this kind of thing, but you have to balance that with the cost. So if we're thinking about cooking training, then maybe it'd be more efficient to just actually get people to cook for real instead of spending money on a device like this, which is quite expensive. Now, if this is something that you're interested in trying out, I think mechanical engineering has a few of these devices. I remember this being mentioned in one of the meetings in that 4D surgery project that I'm on. So maybe we can organize a little bit of a tryout if you want. But moving on, there are also some glove-based solutions. It's a little bit more general. So the touch TM haptic device is really just useful for things that have a handle, kind of like a stylus analogy. The application for a glove device would be a little bit more general, like I said. So, holding fruit, touching a wall, playing piano, just a little bit more general. And the popular way of achieving this at the moment seems to be using some kind of resistive motor, and basically they just attach it to every single joint in your fingers. It looks quite crude, so these devices aren't quite ready for prime time, but it's interesting to note them for us to use in the future, or you might even use them now if you can get your hands on a prototype. But that's if you're really, really determined not to use mixed reality. It's probably just a bit easier to use mixed reality, at least from an implementation standpoint. But while we're on the topic of resistive motors, there is one viable mode that's coming up soon that would be interesting to us as immersive designers, and that's the PlayStation VR hand controller that's coming with a PlayStation VR 2 kit. This is going to be a VR add-on for the PlayStation 5 console. And it's kind of like an El Cheapo version of like the glove-based solutions that we've been talking about, or even mixed reality. But it's also a slightly more refined solution than just the vibration motors that we currently have on the current VR hand controllers. And it's essentially just the same idea as the PS5 controllers, except put into a virtual reality controller. And there's just a physical resistance motor that's attached to the triggers. It can do some precise resistance and some precise types of vibrations, and it seems to do a good enough job of replicating some textures and some sensations that we haven't really been feeling in a consumer level device. So maybe this is the direction that contemporary VR hand controllers are headed, at least before the end of the decade, or when we work out how to directly implant sensations into our brains, just like in the Matrix. Okay, let's spend the next 12 or so minutes looking at some case studies. In the previous slides, we had a look at eye tracking, face tracking, BCIs, and haptics in general, although we did mention a few specific examples. But we can now have a look at how these different things have come together and combined into a perceptible entity. So this could come in the form of a consumer product that's manufactured. In the case of the Oculus Quest Apartment, it's actually a YouTube video. And what that represents is really a full immersive design solution. And I guess my goal for these case studies is just to see how all those different elements can be combined into an immersive design solution. So let's start with the HP Reverb G2 Omnicept. Geez, that's a mouthful. I guess this is a lesson in naming conventions in more ways than one. This headset is part of the Windows Mixed Reality umbrella, so just note that this is distinct to when we say mixed reality in general, where we mean real objects are combined with virtual objects. And when we say Windows Mixed Reality, that's just Microsoft branding the term mixed reality. It's also kind of like when Meta tries to take over the word metaverse. Just something to be careful of. Anyway, there's 3 things of note about the G2, in my opinion anyway. Well, I guess one, we haven't really talked about this too much, but it has a really high resolution display compared to other displays in the past. And it's what we would term as almost retinal resolution. Retinal resolution would essentially be the same resolution as what we would be able to detect with our eyes. Any higher than that, and we wouldn't perceive any better quality. The G2 is not quite there, but it's almost there. So displays like this is where you'd start to be able to read text in a book without having to zoom into it really, really closely. Now, I guess in 2 years' time, it's not really going to be a big deal, kind of like in the same way as HD TVs aren't really a big deal these days, but we're not quite at that point yet, so it's still worth mentioning, but increasingly becoming less relevant. The really interesting parts about the G2 are the extra biometrics that come in the eye tracking and the heart rate sensor. If your experience needs accurate gaze detection using gaze vectors, the G2 isn't a bad option. You've also got some rudimentary neuroelectrical sensors that comes in the form of a heart rate sensor. So if you were designing for corporate training experiences, maybe the G2 would be an option for you as a mode of interaction. Again, I want to caution everyone that we're not really interested in specific hardware products. The interesting thing about this one is the combination of sensors that's available to us to be able to use as immersive designers. So if somewhere down the line you were to see another product that has the same combination and maybe a little bit cheaper, then maybe you might consider that as an option. Okay, let's look at haptics. And that's just how I pronounce that spelling. We're not talking about haptics in general, we're talking about the actual company spelled Hapt and then X. So again, we're not really interested in this specific device or specific company. We're just interested in how they've implemented haptics. So the question we should be asking ourselves is, what kind of data are they taking from the user? What kind of sensory feedback are they giving back to the user? And what kind of applications is this combination actually good for? As of March 2020, Haptics' latest solution is their development kit 2. And let's just go through it really quickly because we're running out of time. What kind of data does it take from the user? It has a hand position, orientation, and then it also has the same thing for each finger. So the thing to note about this particular tracking system is it uses magnetic motion tracking. This is quite a bit more accurate than the others that we've seen so far. For example, the Vive Knuckles controllers only uses capacitive touch, so it has some kind of idea of how far your finger is away from the controller. It gives you a general shape, but it doesn't actually give you accuracy. So just taking this from their website, they claim sub-millimeter precision. Now, you don't really need that kind of accuracy if you're just playing a game and pushing virtual buttons, but you might need that kind of accuracy if you're feeding back your hand information into a robot. And not just any robot, a robot that you expect to be able to similarly do the same tasks as your actual hand needs to do. Like pick up a cup without crushing it or play with a Rubik's Cube. Now, when we think about the task of actually picking up a cup without crushing it, we're not just actually using the position of our fingers, we're also tracking how much pressure we're putting onto the cup using our fingers. We need to make sure that we're putting enough pressure on it that we actually grip it, and when we move our hand, we end up picking it up, but not so much pressure that we actually end up crushing the cup. And I'll add a little caveat here that we're talking about soft plastic cups or paper coffee cups, not the glass cups. I guess it's still quite relevant for the glass cups because robot hands can crush it quite easily. So if you think back to just accurate finger tracking, if we were to make a fist and there was no sensory feedback about how much pressure the robot arm is actually putting onto the object that it's grabbing, then we'd probably just end up crushing whatever it is that the robot hand is holding. But the cool thing about haptics is it also gives you back some force feedback, some pressure feedback. So it more or less replicates what you would be doing just with your normal hand without the robot in between. Now, of course, it doesn't have to be a robot on the other end. It could also be a completely virtual character. So let's say if you are in a virtual reality environment and you were to go ahead and hold an apple in that environment, this solution will also make you feel that apple as if it's actually there. You don't have to pretend that the apple is there and stop yourself consciously from making a full fist. The glove will actually stop you from making a full fist as if the apple was there. The other cool thing to note about this solution is it actually has tactile feedback points attached to your skin. So it can replicate the texture of whatever you're touching, say, let's say a grooved button or a grooved knob or something like that. So unfortunately we don't have an example of this on campus just yet, but we'll see if we can get one. Looks really cool. And mega expensive. Let's talk about something that's not expensive. So the Meta Quest 2, or just the Quest in general, is one of the most accessible standalone virtual reality headsets available to the consumer at the moment. We did cover it a little bit in week 1, and one of the interesting things about the Quest solution is that it can use its SLAM cameras, and let's just remind ourselves that SLAM stands for simultaneous localization and mapping. So this is how the Quest is able to know its physical location within the real world, so then it can use that data maybe in a virtual reality environment to be able to track itself nicely. In addition to knowing the headset's location, we can also use the SLAM cameras to actually track the user's hands. So we don't necessarily need to use the Quest's hand controllers. But the disadvantage of this is you're not holding anything. You essentially just give up any kind of tactile feedback in exchange for more accurate hand representation. But this is only true if you're using completely virtual objects. What if you matched every virtual object to a physical object in the real world? So that's exactly what this dude in this YouTube video did. He mapped every table, every wall, reproduced it in the virtual reality world, and then matched the locations, like basically aligned them. And once that's finished, he could actually just walk around in his apartment with the virtual reality headsets on and add all sorts of embellishments to his environment, but still touch the real objects. He doesn't need a super expensive haptX glove system to give him tactile feedback. It's the actual real objects that's giving him the tactile feedback. I suppose an apartment and a bunch of furniture isn't really that cheap either, so I guess it depends on what you want to prioritize. Anyway, this is a classic example of mixed reality design. Use real objects in conjunction with virtual objects, and that's basically the classic definition of mixed reality. And essentially that's what all the rest of the case studies are based on. Incidentally, I think I've been talking for a bit more than an hour for this lecture, so I'm gonna try and wrap it up. Zero Latency, The Void, and the ACE Training Center, they all use mixed reality techniques to create their simulations. The zero latency format is essentially just a big warehouse where you have one-to-one spatial environment, so you can pretty much walk without using any locomotion solutions. They also give you a toy gun, so you can feel like you're holding a real gun. The Void, although they are no longer functioning at the moment, maybe they'll come back later, But the Void is essentially the same thing, except they add walls, and then they also add like heaters and fans to make you feel temperature and wind and stuff like that. So you could have a situation where you're looking out into a cliff, and that cliff is looking over a river of lava, and there'd be like a heater blowing at you, but since you had the headset on, it looks like you're standing over, I don't know, like a hellscape. And that's a really cool, powerful experience, but done really cheaply and safely. The ACE Training Center again is taking it up a notch. And I guess one thing I'll say is one of the simulators there is so good that CASA, the Civil Aviation and Safety Authority here in Australia, will give you a certificate if you qualified on that simulator for that particular aircraft. Teresa told me not to talk too much about the ACE Training Center because you guys cover it in 9901. But yeah, I just thought I'd mention it because they're really cool. And that's the end, even though we're a little bit over time. Thank you for listening.